Doesn't it seem to you that banking's becoming progressively worse and it's really happened in the last few years? Well, it's because it has, and this is just the beginning. Do you know how they say that larger banks are too big to fail? Well, unfortunately for small town USA, the regional banks are too small to succeed. All of the money is systematically leaving smaller regional banks. It's going to larger ones, and it's all by design. This is the beginning of a seismic shift for the future of the banking sector, and it's time to take a dive into the megabank monopoly. Let's get it. Welcome to BitBoy Crypto. My name is Ben. In this video, we're going to zoom in on the idea that our own government is encouraging the largest banks in America to engulf the smaller banks in a coordinated effort to centralize control. Understand that in today's financial climate, being a smaller bank is like bringing a slingshot to a shootout. We all know that money is power, and if my journey in crypto and politics has taught me anything, it's that America cares about one thing: having control. If you think things got bad in the last 20 years, just think about how much more control they'll have 20 years from now. And narrowing down who gets to control all the money is a great place to start. Now, before we get down into the nitty-gritty, I want to keep it real with you. As complicated as all this is about to get, I want to start off with a very basic concept so you can see firsthand how bad the situation already is. Let's take a quick look at this chart of the largest banks in the U.S. Does anything about this chart seem suspicious to you? Does anything seem wrong here? Look at the drastic difference between the big four and everyone else. Now, I can prove my point with just this chart. It's no secret who the big four banks are in the United States: JP Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, and Wells Fargo. And Wells Fargo has over $1 trillion more than U.S. Bank, who's in 5th place. These four banks are the main players in the game, and it's most likely going to stay that way because these banks are the main benefactor in the dilemma our own government created. You should know that all of these banks are defined as G-SIBs, or globally systematically important banks. Basically, they're held to a higher standard because of the risk they pose to the system if they were to fail. They get special treatment to avoid another terrible ending to a non-fiction movie. Alternatively, now that things have worsened for smaller regional banks, the Biden administration wants to change small bank standards so they have similar liquidity requirements to the larger ones. This tougher standard gives the smaller banks less wiggle room. When you pair this with high inflation and higher interest, what you'll eventually get is a seismic shift in the banking world, because that standard is unattainable for more banks than you would think, and they're going to reach a point where the only way out is to consolidate. This concept is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, remember that first chart? Now look at this one. This is a chart of deposits by bank size. How in the world are the small banks going to be competitive when they're getting outperformed this badly? It's like a high school team having to play, I don't know, the Georgia Bulldogs, or maybe like another college team having to play the Georgia Bulldogs. They're that good. Believe me when I tell you though, banking is Darwinism at its finest. It's survival of the fittest. So what do large fund investors think about this from an investment standpoint? Well, just ask Bill and a grin from Oakmark. Watch this.
At Oakmark, our view has been that the largest banks have a strong competitive advantage versus smaller banks, and that the natural tendency is for the number of banks to shrink and the big to get bigger. They just have advantages when it comes to regulatory requirements, meeting regulatory requirements, mobilization, fraud control. If you're 10 times as big as somebody else, those costs aren't 10 times as large.
Right. Now I want you to ask yourself, would investors on this scale waste their time investing in smaller banks? Of course not. Why would they? He said it himself. The number of banks is going to shrink and the mega banks will keep adding zeros. To be fair, the U.S. has more banks than all the other G7 countries combined. So of course, there will be some consolidation, but when and where will it end? Problem is, the standards of banking are what caused all of the recent bank failures, and those same standards are preventing the smaller banks from getting larger. It's a double-edged sword, and there's no incentive for the government to find a middle ground. What do you think our government would rather do? Help the little man or continue co-signing to consolidations to centralize control? I feel like you already know that answer. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say that these banks are light years ahead of their competitors, and they really are too big to fail. Think of the enormity of advantage the Big Four has over the rest of the game. It's like playing Monopoly against the banker. They always roll doubles and don't play free parking. Instead, landing on boardwalk and paying luxury tax out the wazoo. Now, why don't you play along with us and become a member of the BitSquad? Be sure to subscribe, smash that like button, and ring the bell for notifications. Also, big thanks to Stake for sponsoring this video. They're our #1 sponsor. Check out bitboycrypto.com/stake. Okay, let's look at the banking failures in recent history. You know, Silvergate, First Republic, Silicon Valley. And now look at that through the lens of how small businesses were forced to shut their doors because they couldn't compete with Walmart. It's the same thing. Look at it through the lens of cell phone companies. Yeah, there's smaller ones out there, but let's be honest. The majority go with either Verizon, T-Mobile, or AT&T. It's not supposed to get boiled down to 3 like cell phones. It's advantageous for your everyday American to have multiple banking options because it forces the banks to be competitive with each other and actually have customer service. Stifling that competition leads to higher rates and less choices for customers. Not to mention, it sets the standard for anti-capitalism. It will also hinder innovation because smaller banks are more likely to offer innovative products and services to stand out in the crowd. With less banks to choose from, you won't be able to take your money and go down the street, shop for a better rate on a car loan. Unethical banking practices will only get worse because where are you going to go? Who are you going to go to? Do you think that the bigger banks have any sense of sportsmanship for the smaller banks? Absolutely not. They don't want competition. This is a win for them. They want to crush them. It's all greed. Back before the sell-offs, the megabanks circled over Silicon Valley and First Republic like vultures. Did you know that JP Morgan's profits in Q2 this year jumped 67%? Why? Because they bought out First Republic Bank, and in the process, they kept as many of their customers as they could. And not to mention, interest rates are higher. One bank loss is another bank's gain. According to the Wall Street Journal, the 25 biggest U.S. banks gained $120 billion in deposits in the days after Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. All the banks below that level lost $108 billion over the same time span. Some people like Jamie Dimon will tell you the worst is over. He's wrong, it's yet to come. Think about this. If the small banks have no choice but to keep consolidating the predatory practices the banks already pull on us, well, they're just going to multiply. Think about how much control your bank already has over you today. Hidden fees, higher rates, and bending over backwards just to get a small loan is one thing. But what about the headache you have to go through just to spend your own money? A bank shouldn't be able to tell you what you can or cannot spend your hard-earned money on. But they do this every single day. Don't even get me started. I can't even go to a normal bank. I really can't. They won't take me, and I'm not alone. Ask Drew about the time his bank didn't want him to take his own money out to buy a house. Ask AJ about the time his debit card got shut off with no warning. Ask Nick about the time they shut down his bank account for no reason at all, and when he asked for an explanation, they told him they didn't have to tell him why. I can go on and on and on. Those are just people I know, and I'm sure you've got a personal nightmare story of your own. But the point I'm making here is it already feels like we have very little control in the institutions that were put there to protect our money. They don't respect us as humans, and it's all about the algorithms designed to facilitate the transfer of control. Unfortunately, the smaller banks are going to be forced to continue consolidating, giving all the money, all the power, all the control to the chosen elite. Obvious side note, of course they hate crypto. It's the only thing that gives the power back to the people. That's why they're pushing so hard to eliminate it. It scares them. You want to know what scares me more than anything? Regardless, if it's one bank, 4 banks, or whatever with all the control, America's debt is at $32.6 trillion and counting. Maybe not in my lifetime, but there has to come a moment where we stop kicking the can down the road, when you stop spreading risk around and centralize control. We enter a situation where there's a single point of failure, which would make this 10 times worse if it all comes crashing down. We don't even need a debt ceiling crisis to ruin the U.S. credit system. We're already centralizing all the risk into 4 players. So how did it get this way, and why did these consolidations happen? Well, I'm sure you remember the 2008 banking crisis that ended in a bailout. Since the government and the FDIC don't want to take another dent of that magnitude, they raised the standards for liquidity and put harsh restrictions on what banks can or cannot invest in. Some of you would know this as the Volcker Rule, which was part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill. You can thank our old friend, the banking broad, Elizabeth Warren, for that one. This rule is why banks can no longer invest in anything that is deemed too risky. Sure, it prevents them from getting wrecked, but it also prevents them from using money to make money. And of course, who suffers the most? The average Joe, you and me. So what are the banks doing now that they can't take risks on? To answer this, I want you to think back to the days when interest rates were much lower. Remember when money was cheap? It was easy to go to the bank and get a loan if you wanted to go buy a house. Why do you think so many people under 30 don't own homes now? Because they can't. That flexibility is gone. Anyway, back when interest rates were low and money was cheap, there was a lot of extra liquidity moving around the banking system. Because of that, you would see a lot of big investors and venture capitalist money moving into riskier startups and starting new businesses. And of course, they'll get the money to do that from easier to get banking loans. When the conditions were like this, you would see a lot of uninsured deposits at the bank. Remember, since the banks can't take risk, they had to take safer long-term investments with their money. For the most part, they went heavy into government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, the kind of investments that are long-term and low risk. This move they were forced into making is part of what took them down. When the banks bought those safer securities, they essentially made a bet that the interest rates wouldn't go higher. And unfortunately, we all know what happened last year. The Christmas elf himself, Jerome Powell, and the gang spent the entirety of 2022 hiking interest rates to fight against inflation. They spent the entire year creating more problems to combat a problem they created. It was a perfect storm in the worst way for your everyday American. Between higher rates and a tightening money supply, people had no choice but to withdraw money out of the banks. And when banks start to see money flying out by the boatload, they get to a point where they have to sell those safer securities they bought with their excess money. The problem was, because the rates were higher, the bonds they were forced to sell were sold at a loss. Because Trump rolled back some of the Dodd-Frank rules, some banks didn't have to report unrealized losses. But when unrealized losses become real losses, it became a much different story. Between taking those losses, bad management, and making terrible risk assessments, that's when the dominoes started to fall. That's when banks like First Republic and Silicon Valley had no choice but to sell stocks and borrow large quantities of money from other banks. This caused their investor and customer base to lose confidence and try to pull their money out as fast as possible, especially those uninsured deposits who have more than 250 grand, because the rest is uninsured. This right here is a main reason why so many people are siding with the big four banks. Because even if the FDIC insurance rate of $250K is the same for small and large banks, it would take catastrophic circumstances for large banks to fail. Not to mention, the government wouldn't let it happen anyways. People know that big banks won't fail, and they're not about to put their life savings into a circumstance where they can only get $250,000 back if the bottom falls out. And trust me, the interest rates, well, they're not quite done hiking yet. This cycle will repeat itself as many times as it has to. And by now you're thinking, is there some sort of plan? What are the regulators gonna do? Watch this. This clip here really sums it all up.
The regionals are problematic because they keep losing their deposits and have to keep reducing their balance sheet. So for the regionals, I don't think earnings have bottomed. And I wouldn't even think about buying them until I thought that they had. You know, you could traffic a little bit in the larger banks, but the problem is that Michael Barr, who's vice chair of financial supervision, just said that he's going to raise capital requirements for the large banks by 20%, which would take ROEs down by 100 to 200 basis points. There's an irony in this, by the way. All the problems that happened in the banks were in the mid-cap banks. The large banks, because of all the regulatory changes, were fine. So what do the regulators do? They go fight the last war, and they're raising capital requirements of the large banks. Why? I mean, there's absolutely no reason for it, but that's what they're doing.
Do the regulators do anything at all to help out the smaller banks? Of course not. In fact, they intend to raise capital requirements by 20% for the larger banks. A surefire way to ensure the failure of everyone that's beneath them. It's as if they want to consolidate the power. Imagine that. The man from the previous clip, well, that's Steve Eisman. He's famous on Wall Street. If you've ever seen the movie The Big Short, his character was played by Steve Carell. And yes, he really did answer his phone in that meeting.
Prime losses will stop at 5%. Zero. Excuse me. I have to take this.
He must be from Bank of America.
Yeah.
All jokes aside here, what he just said in that clip is directly in line with the narrative of the regional banks failing and the larger banks taking over. I agree with him all that. Of all people, this guy knows a dumpster fire when he sees one. I agree with him that the smaller banks have no choice but to keep reducing their balance sheets, and that's why they haven't hit their bottom. My opinion differs from him, though, when he says that there's absolutely no reason for the regulators' large bank reaction to the problems with the smaller banks. Have to disagree. The reason's right in front of our faces. The regulators are raising capital requirements for the larger banks to encourage them to keep getting bigger, and that consequently makes it that much harder for smaller banks to grow. On the flip side, the Treasury Secretary herself, Janet Yellen, aka the Tweety Bird monster, will tell you that they're not encouraging this type of activity. Another classic example of watch what they do, not what they say. Now this clip is my favorite. Check it out.
So what is your plan to keep large depositors from moving their funds out of community banks into the big banks? We have seen the mergers of banks over the past decade. I'm concerned you're about to accelerate that by encouraging anyone who has a large deposit in a community bank to say, we're not going to make you whole, but if you go to one of our preferred banks, we will make you whole at that point.
That's certainly not something that we're encouraging.
That is happening right now.
That is happening because depositors are concerned about the bank failures that have happened and whether or not other banks could also
No,
fail.
it's happening
And
because you're
it's-
fully insured no matter what the amount is if you're in a big bank. You're not fully insured if you're in a community bank.
Well,
In all of my years of watching Janet no-tell and Yellen lie to Americans about how she's protecting them, I've never once seen her stumble and fumble over words like she did in this clip. The best part is, 30 seconds after getting put in the political equivalent of a stone cold stunner, she says that her judgment is that the banking system is safe and sound and depositors should have confidence. Hysterical. Then when asked why some banks get special treatment and why others don't, she said that she didn't know and it's up for the FDIC to decide. The lengths people like Janet Yellen go to protect depositors, all while simultaneously hurting depositors, is astounding. Reminds me of Gary Gensler. And in that lies a part of the problem. Getting a straight answer from a politician is like asking your mom for $5 and she tells you to ask your dad and he tells you to ask your mom and you never get the $5. Lack of accountability in our government has a lot to do with the fact it's so easy for a three-letter agency to point the finger at another three-letter agency to pass the buck. With this, they all maintain a level of plausible deniability and get to go home and tell their families they're making a difference. What a joke. It's a joke. But wait, this is our money, this is our freedom. It's not a joke. And what's anybody gonna do about it? Look, it's as simple as this. Politicians and regulators need to wake up and get it through their heads that small town America needs smaller banks. Where are we supposed to go to get loans if the banks that used to support small businesses have their hands tied? And Jamie Dimon has the key. We need that competition for competitive rates, and we need small banks to keep innovating to earn their market share. At this point, with the way things are going, for the regional banks to survive, they'll be forced to tighten lending standards, make fewer loans, slowing down the economy for everybody. And now, with Biden's knee-jerk push to heighten capital requirements on small banks, politicians cannot sit there with a straight face and say they're not encouraging the consolidations. I'm also not saying this great consolidation will happen overnight. Take years, maybe even decades, unless the right people get elected and care enough to prevent it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying small banks shouldn't have regulations. Of course they do. Just the right kinds of regulations that involve common sense. Banks should be transparent. They should take stress tests. They still need enough wiggle room to be competitive as well as profitable. Sad part is, it would take nothing short of a miracle for the public's faith to be restored in smaller banks. Obviously, everyone wants their money to be safe. So I don't blame anyone personally for jumping ship to a bigger bank if they have to, or if you're allowed to. But when this happens in droves and the government is backing it, you have to play the tape out and see how slippery this slope really is. So at this point, other than voting in the polls and with our wallets, there's only so much we can do to hold on to the little bit of control we have left. And we have to make the most of it that we can. First of all, you have to be aware that the landscape is changing. And with that, you need to do your part and self-educate yourself and become self-reliant. I don't say it lightly. And if you made it this far in this video, you obviously care about your financial future, but you need to keep going. If you're someone who's struggling, or even someone who's just trying to level up, you need to plan out every minute of your day so you can make time to be studying at least 3 to 4 hours a day minimum. If you're someone that's got a lot of moving parts, There's no shame in hiring a financial advisor or someone that can help you be more active with your wealth management. Understand that at the end of the day, the big banks don't care about you or your self-interest. It's only about the bottom line for them. So that's why you need to learn as much as you can and take the time to figure out what works for you. With that, don't make the same mistakes the banks are making. Don't put all your eggs in one basket and expose yourself to the risk of having a single point of failure. Cannot stress how important it is for you to diversify. Split everything up, so if one vertical fails, you're still well above water. Consider buying gold, buying stocks, holding cash, buying digital assets like Bitcoin, or even ammunition. If diplomacy fails, water and ammunition will become currency. It's clear I've been hanging out with Drew too much, but hey, he's right. He's also kind of scary, but I like him. He's a good guy. At the end of the day, your financial future is up to you. So I wish you the best on your journey and your never-ending pursuit of financial education. That's all I got. Be blessed. Big boy out.